First, I would like to thank Dominique for a really exciting conference. I think everybody's learning a lot. And I would like to apologize to the people that read my paper because I was trying to meet Dominique's deadline, and there are a couple of inaccuracies in the paper, especially figure one, should ignore it. Having worked on the Holodomor for about at least 4 years with my colleagues in Kyiv Institute of Demography, I realized that according to professors Kuczycki's estimate, there are at least 20,000 entries of the Holodomor, but most of them are written in Ukrainian and published in Ukraine. Few of them have been published in the Western scientific journals and books according to widely accepted standards of research. And there's no guiding structure to try to put some order in this massive amount of research. And to make things even worse, we do not have consensus on two key concepts. What is the Holodomor and what are losses of the Holodomor? So I decided to do something that may be considered suicidal, try to come up with a framework to try to put some structure that will guide us in, first of all, synthesize what we have achieved and try to provide some guidance for future research. So, first of all, I would like to point out what are the definitions we are using about Holodomor. And that is, this is a famine in Soviet Ukraine between 1932 and 34. We also have shown that there were Holodomor losses in 34, beyond 33. So this excludes what happened in Russia, in Kuban specifically, and what happened outside of this period, like the 21-23 famine, or deaths after 35 to 39. And our definition of losses, demographers use two losses, direct and indirect. We are dealing only with the direct losses, which are deaths on top of the normal death that would have occurred had there been no famine. So these are the two definitions we are using in our analysis. Now, the first thing I would like to point out is that there is a lack of understanding between the difference of registered deaths and what we mean by losses, because the concept of losses is key in the framework I'm proposing. I think it's important to clarify these two concepts. So in this graph, you have, first of all, in the first bar in each year, what would be more or less normal death had there been no famine. And then in the third bar, we have what are registered deaths. And you see the big jump in 1933. So, and here's the difference. So what happens is that already the official registration of death in the system of our statistics in the Soviet Union shows something extraordinary is happening in 32, especially in 33, and then to some degree in 34. Now, if we look at this graph, we see that here we have, here we have the losses we estimated, and here we have the registration figure. So the registration figure already encompasses two types of deaths, the normal death and the excess death caused by the famine. But as you can see, the difference between registration and the total number of deaths is huge, and the losses here are what should be put on top of the normal death. And we see that the losses are higher than the total number of registered deaths. In other words, more than half of the deaths, especially in 33, were not registered, and that poses a big problem when we talk about estimation of losses. So to repeat again, losses are excess deaths on top of normal death that happened because of the Holodomor, otherwise would not have happened. Now, the framework I'm proposing is very simple. We divide everything we know about the Holodomor, or not know, in 3 stages. What happened before the Holodomor, what happened during the Holodomor, and what are the consequences of the Holodomor. And the key concept in the module 2 is losses of the Holodomor. So in the first module, we are dealing with causes of the Holodomor and factors associated with the Holodomor. In the second module, we basically are looking at the estimation of losses, first by geographical units and then by different characteristics that we will go into. And then we, in the third module, we look at the consequences of the Holodomor. So so here in the second module, we have estimates that we have produced first by all the Soviet republics, not just Ukraine, all the Soviet republics, we estimated losses. And then we have urban-rural losses by urban-rural areas, and then by oblasts and by rayons. And this applies to Ukraine and to Russia by urban-rural and by krais. We do not have estimates by rayons for Russia yet. And then we have characteristics like age, sex by nationalities in Ukraine and by month in 1933. So what we are looking at is that in the first part, we look at factors that would explain the losses. And the factors are basically economic factors, I'll elaborate, weather factors, political, and some controls. And this is important. Economic factors are the ones that are proposed by the Russian position or the Soviet position. This was basically a complex phenomena. We have to collectivize. We had to get grain to industrialize the country. Well, there were some problems, mismanagement, etc., but basically it was nothing political. In the political category, we have things mentioned by Professor Kuczynski. We had repression, we had resistance, we had repressions, we had searches for grain. In many cases, they took away all the food. We had closing of borders, and we had also limiting migration to the cities of peasants. So these are what I call the political types of factors. Now, in the second part, we try to explain the consequences of the Holodomor, taking into account as a key variable the losses and other variables. And I will proceed to give some examples of how you can use this scheme to try to answer different questions. So the uses of this Holodomor are provide a structure for organizing the research, test hypotheses or accepted statements that may be inaccurate, debunk the Russian version of the Holodomor. It's a powerful tool to address one of the key issues of the 2 main versions about the Holodomor. Was it by accident or man-made? And this is a macro framework. We have heard about micro questions here, but this is a different set that requires a different framework. And also, I'd like to stress the importance of comparative research. One of the negative aspects of the Holodomor research, there's been very little comparative research, especially with Russia. And that's very important. So here are the kind of components of what is called the man-made by accident modernization. It's a complex phenomena affected many parts of the Soviet Union: collectivization, excessive grain requisition, mismanagement, climatic factors. But in the man-made on purpose, we claim that there was a generalized famine in 32, and then famine as a weapon of terror in 1933, according to Koczycki's model. There were resistance, repressions, closing of borders, blackboards, fines in kind, etc. So here is a first example. How do we deal with the statement, everybody suffered the same? According to our estimates, there was a total of 8.7 million losses for the whole Soviet Union between 32 and 34. Out of that, we had 3.9 million for Ukraine, 3.3 for Russia, and then 1.2 for Kazakhstan, and then others much less. But if you want to compare, you cannot compare absolute numbers. You have to compare relative numbers by population size. So if you divide these losses by population size, you will see that Kazakhstan had the highest losses, 22% per thousand, 22 per thousand, following by Ukraine in 13%, 13 per thousand, I'm sorry. No, this is percent, 13% of the population. And then Russia, only 3%. In other words, in relative terms, the losses of Russia are 1/4 of the losses of Ukraine. So this is the first example. Here it illustrates the concept of not all the republics had the same effect. Because if you take the example of Ukraine, just by looking at birth and death official, we see that in 1933, there was a big jump of death and a dip in the birth. So we have a very strong difference in this period for Ukraine. In Central Asia republics, we did have a jump in death in 33, but it never reached the level of birth. So it was still positive growth and a dip in the birth. Well, in the Transcaucasus republics, the effect of the famine was minimal, almost non-existent. Now, a second example is that a hypothesis that people had that the largest losses should be in the grain-growing regions of Ukraine, in the south of Ukraine. But our research showed that is not the case. The largest losses are in Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast, and we have an article published in the Canadian Journal of Population that tries to explain these differences, the reasons, and we have very small loss in Chernihiv and Donetsk. So this is an example where we have a historical hypothesis that a demographic analysis shows that it's incorrect. And then we had to ask historians to help us to explain why. And now we are getting into the interdisciplinary strategy of research. I will mention that briefly in more detail a bit later. Now, a second example is that according to Graziosi and others, the roots of the famine are in 1917-18. The rebellion against collectivization and grain procurement in those times. And Graziosi says, if you can find a map of rebellions by rayons and compare that with a map of losses by a rayon, they should be similar. The problem is we don't have the data for this map yet, but people have begun to work on it. So moving, now Another example is everybody, only Ukrainians were the target of the Holodomor. Well, we did estimates of losses by nationality, and you will see that everybody experienced losses, from Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, Germans, Jews, but Ukrainians suffered the most. Ukrainians suffered twice as much as all the other nationalities. So if they tell you the argument was that only Ukrainians suffered, number one, that's not true. Number two, Ukrainians suffered the most. The question is why? Have to try to explain that. And then the example of what happened in early 1933, there was an explosion of death in the first half of 33, and this is the average daily number of losses by month in 33 for Ukraine. And you see it went from about 300,000 in January to 28,000 deaths per day. This is unusual. I would say this is a unique phenomenon in all man-made famines that we know about, and has not been researched adequately. We have plotted the slope of increase of these relative losses by different regions, first for Ukraine and regions in Russia. So we have three categories. We have Ukraine and Krasnodar in northern Kuban have the highest slope, highest rate of death losses by month. Then we have in the middle, we have Saratov and Northern Caucasus without Krasnodar. And then we have very low losses in Central Volga, Lower Volga without Saratov and the Germans, and the Black Earth. So even in some regions of Russia, we had an increase in death, but the slope of the increase is very different, from very high to very low. So I did an analysis of where are the political factors present. And we see that the political factors are present in Ukraine and Krasnodar with a high growth. And we have no political factors in Central Volga, Black Earth, and Lower Volga without Krasnodar. And this model allows us to show that political factors are crucial in explaining the very high growth of death in the first half of 33 compared to these regions where there were no political factors, and the main factor was basically biology of a famine. I don't have time to talk about this in detail, maybe during the discussion or in the paper explained in more detail. And okay.
We have to end on it.
Well, I'll have to come back to this. I'm sorry.